Dorhan's getting on the link in a second. So only 5% of rare diseases have an approved drug therapy. Only 60% of orphan medicines approved by the US FDA or the EU EMA are approved in Canada, and they often come here many months or years later. If you've been following CORD for a while, you'll see some of the data that CORD has shared with the governments show a worsening gap in terms of what's available south of the border, already approved by the US FDA, versus what's even been submitted here to Health Canada. And the latest stats that we've seen show that since the Pmprb regulations were finalized in August 2019, there have been 84 drugs approved by the US FDA, and fully 51 have not yet even been submitted to Health Canada. And that's one of the reasons why Dorhan and CORD wanted to hold another webinar on the Pmprb. The other is the fast approaching July 1st implementation of these regulations. These regulations have been delayed twice, last summer and then last December, and they are now scheduled to come into place on July 1st, just in a couple of weeks. And there's a lot of developments that have happened since then. So I'm going to take 10 minutes and walk you through and remind people what's happened with the Pmprb or what they plan to do. And then on a couple of the developments. And then we're going to have two amazing panels. The first panel is going to be with experts and medicine developers. And the second panel is going to be with patient organizations who have been very involved and at the coalface of some of these consultations for the last several years. And we're going to have a wrap up, and we're just thrilled to have Rosalie Wyonch from the C.D. Howe Institute as a respondent to help summarize and provide some takeaways and some macroeconomic perspectives. So thank you, Rosalie, for being here. Two housekeeping items. One, there's a chat function. You'll see the panel over there. Please ask your questions as you listen to the panelists. Get involved and provide your comments and thoughts. And second, we're going to be uploading a couple of files in there. CORD has recently engaged the services and the advice from Professor Donald Savoy. He's very well known in public policy circles as an expert on governance. So wanted to look at some of the recent activities of the Pmprb from a perspective of the duty of a quasi-judicial regulator, which is the duty of neutrality. So thank you, Angela, for uploading that. Feel free to pull that off of the chat box. We're also going to upload the PDF of these slides today, which you'll see has lots of links to different resources. And finally, I said there were two things. This webinar is being recorded, and it will be up on CORD's YouTube channel either later today or sometime tomorrow. Dorhan, do you want to say a few words before we jump in on the recap?
Yeah, no, sorry about that. I got a little hung up trying to get into the webinar. So thank you guys so much for starting. And I heard definitely you're saying the reason for it. No, I think we've got a really full agenda, and it is something that, you know, to be honest with you, when we first posted this webinar, this was not our intent. We had hoped that we would actually be talking about some other kinds of solutions towards assuring that we've got access to medicines that are being developed elsewhere, and also the promotion of medicines development here. But as Bill says, some of the events over the last couple weeks have really put a spotlight in terms of why this discussion is urgent. And we really thank everybody for joining in. And we do hope that at the end of this, we will talk about what are some next steps that are possible. So, you know, over to you, Bill, to kind of take us through some very quick, bringing us up to speed. And then, as you say, we've got some amazing panels.
Okay, great. So I'm going to get right at it because we're already a few minutes behind. CORD has not done a webinar on the Pmprb for about 6 months now. So for some of you, this is going to be a refresher, and others who have been following this more closely, you're already aware. Today, under the current existing rules, the Pmprb regulates the maximum prices for patented medicines, and it uses two general tools to do that. One is what's the therapeutic value versus other alternatives that can be used on the market in Canada, and second, country comparison tests. So we are compared to the Pmprb 7, and that's France, UK, Italy, Germany, Sweden, Switzerland, and the United States. The Pmprb also regulates the level of price increases that manufacturers can take for patented medicines on an annual basis, but those price increases are negligible or rarely taken. And in fact, price increases for the provincial governments are often not permitted whatsoever. So what that's actually done, as we've seen, is medicine prices have been below the median of those Pmprb 7 countries for decades now. And as you can see on the bottom right, I should say, first of all, about 20% below the median of those Pmprb 7. If you're just looking at the median, we are right in the middle of those 7 comparator countries. Manufacturers also offer rebates to Canadian governments, I should say also in private payers increasingly, that drive prices down for public payers by an average of 30%. There are 2 key changes that are planned for implementation on July 1st. The first is they'll remove the US and Switzerland from the basket, and they're going to add a number of lower priced jurisdictions to the basket to compare. And that change alone will lead to price adjustments of between 20 and 30%. There's an interesting poster from the CATA symposium from last year, if you want to take a look at some analysis there. And that's bringing down the public list price by a further 20%. The new economic factors have been added to the regulations. They are going to actually import some of the tools that CADIF uses and INES use in terms of a cost per quality adjusted life year, so pharmacoeconomic value, and market size adjustments. So the more you sell, the price will decrease on an annual basis based on how much you sold the year before. So net 20% list price reduction, and then the new economic factors for new products could bring the further price reductions of up to 50% below that already reduced price. And in this area, they would actually be looking at your the manufacturer's net price with those rebates that I talked about earlier. These changes, I should say, have already had some impacts on things that are important for patients. One, of course, is access to medicines, and I mentioned that earlier in terms of what medicines are available in the States versus what are available here. And there's some similar analysis that are done in terms of global launches. Let's not just look at the United States. Let's look globally. And I've presented this slide a couple of times. This is done by IQVIA for Life Sciences Ontario last summer, and they looked at what's happened in 2019. The regulations were introduced in 2017. 2018, 2019 saw the lowest number of globally launched medicines in 15 years in Canada. And in fact, to even figure out where that sort of sits vis-a-vis globally, we had to look back and move the line of global launches up, because generally Canada gets access 2 years after their launch. Drugs are often launched globally. And historical trends suggest we should have had closer to 30 medicines in 2019. Another way that patients depend on getting earlier access, given that longer time lag to have drugs launched in Canada, is through clinical trials. And there's been some published data that shows that manufacturer-sponsored clinical trials have also decreased since the adoption of the new regulations. As well, and this happened in September of 2020, right in the thick of COVID, the Pmprb put in a COVID exception. The economic factors would not apply to COVID vaccines and therapies. And here's an op-ed that was published by the head of Pfizer Canada, noting that if the government had applied its Pmprb regime to COVID vaccine candidates at the time, the ability to move at the speed of science would have been restricted. And this was really the first time that the government acknowledged that these are a potential barrier to access to new medicines. Notwithstanding that, and this is I'll show 2 slides to just bring people up to speed on some of the new developments. A few weeks ago, a member of parliament who's very connected to the rare disease community because he's got 3 kids with rare disorders, Tom Kimmich from Calgary, got access to a communications plan developed by the Pmprb in early February. And this was, of course, and this will be a discussion of our second panel, and we might get into it in the first panel, but this is the subject of that memorandum from Professor Savoie that I mentioned that's in the chat group. Please go and pull it down. Basically, the communications plan is more, or it looks like, an advocacy plan. For the Pmprb, the problem is that there's an impression that public opinion is tilted against their efforts. They identify specific stakeholders and say that they have disseminated disinformation, including CORD. They have plans to accentuate the positive. They paint stakeholders in a negative light. They plan to extend the voices of supportive stakeholders, and they have targeted special outreach activities to supportive stakeholders of the reforms. And they have information kits for MPs. This is not usual for a quasi-judicial agency to have a communications plan or an advocacy plan like this. And of course, we'll talk more about that in this in this webinar with the panelists. A few other things that are happening right now on this issue. The Pmprb is right now consulting on its guideline monitoring and evaluation plan, how it will monitor and report on the impacts of its own regulations. This is a bit different. If you look at CADIF and other organizations, they have external reviewers. The Quebec government and the Ontario government have raised flags about this, and Quebec is actually formally opposing the reforms or the proposed changes as unconstitutional. And the government of Ontario has sent several letters asking for the regulations to be delayed to allow more analysis to happen. And finally, although there's lots more happening, we can probably get into it, the government of Canada, the Parliament of Canada is actually reviewing this through the House of Commons Health Committee. I thought that it was all over last Friday. That was the last formal meeting, but it turns out tomorrow afternoon, there's going to be another meeting on where this issue will likely come up at 1 o'clock. So get ready to watch another health committee meeting for all of you who tuned in last Friday to what we thought was the last one on this. There are 71 submissions that have been uploaded to that website, so definitely worth poking around. So with that, maybe I'll just, looking for my other panel, I'll just introduce them because, and stop sharing now. We're just thrilled to have panel one come and join us. So if you wouldn't mind putting on your videos and your mics again. The panels that we have been asked to review the Pmprb changes in the context of access to rare disease medicines, especially given that they're really fast approaching. And the first panel we've got, we're going to look at them. What are the expected impacts? What else could we do differently, including encouraging the adoption of rare disease strategies that work in other jurisdictions. So who we have Wayne Critchley, Senior Associate, Health and Life Sciences at Global Public Affairs. Everyone here knows Wayne because for a good amount of time, Wayne served as chair of the Canadian Organization for Rare Disorders. Relevant to this discussion, he also served for many years as the executive director of the Pmprb in earlier times. We're also joined by Neil Palmer, principal consultant at WN Palmer and Company. And Neil is also no stranger to CORD, has been out to several of these events. So welcome, Neil, former senior leader at the Pmprb, but since then, a real expertise on global pricing and reimbursement, as well as Canada and how it works here. So thrilled to have you back, Neil. We're also joined by Marissa Poole, a general manager at Sanofi Genzyme Canada. One of the Genzyme has long been a leader in the rare diseases space, and Marissa, you've had leadership positions in other jurisdictions and have been in Canada for a couple of years now. So looking forward to your perspectives on, hey, could something else work that's working elsewhere, and what are you seeing actually happen with these changes? And Lorene Redding is head of value access and policy at Beijing, Canada. Welcome, Lorene. Again, I think you've been out to CORD events in the past, has sat on some of the consultation opportunities by the PMPRB and like extensive experience, especially in health economics and policy, going back many years, and really at the coalface on how these changes will actually impact decisions around prices in Canada and hopefully policy and market access. So with that, I'm gonna launch in. Please use the chat group to jump in and ask your own questions. But you know, my first post or request to the panel would be to Wayne and Neil. Tell us a bit more about how the PMPRB operated, or maybe even operates today. I mean, I showed one slide on that in terms of basket of countries, therapeutic tests, et cetera. But what has changed, and what do these changes represent from your perspective? Maybe we'll start with Wayne, if you wouldn't mind.
Sure, happy to, Bill. And first of all, thanks very much to you and Durhan for the invitation to come back and join a court event. It's great to see so many familiar faces, or at least names, on the screen. Yeah, I'm going to really approach this, Bill, by thinking of the early days of PMPRB and a couple of the very key issues that are in front of us today. PMPRB was created as following a very contentious public debate that went on for years over pharma policy and IP policy. And the board was created as a compromise. But like many compromises, it didn't have a lot of fans. People still had competing sides. And so the board was born in that environment. And it was created in a very unique way as a quasi-judicial tribunal. So it's a court. A very unique way to control drug prices. And I think we all know the context, that it was to prevent abuses of the new patent protection that pharmaceutical patentees acquired as a result of Bill C-22 back in 1987. So this created a challenge for the board as to how to conduct itself. There were a lot of people who really believed that it would not be able to withstand legal scrutiny and challenges. And so the first chair, Harry Eastman, put together a team that spent a lot of time trying to make the program work, achieve the government's goal of having this compromise actually function without falling on its face in its first few years. And there were two elements to that that were key. One was to recognize that it's an impartial board. It's a court. It has to be completely free of bias. It cannot favor one side over the other. It has to look for some happy median based on the requirements of the Act. The Act is its guide. The other thing is that there's no way that you can control drug prices by conducting hearings on every single drug that are being sold in this country. That's simply an unworkable, unsustainable approach. And so it developed guidelines that were developed in consultation with a lot of controversy, of course, but guidelines that everybody could live with. And so we weren't in court every 5 seconds having to take companies to court. And the system prevailed all that time. And the board was always criticized. I'll tell you, criticized by both sides. I still bear a lot of the scars. In fact, sometimes in the last month, I think I'm experiencing PTSD because I remember all those scars and these battles that go on. You're either, from the pharma industry side, you're too rigid, you're going too far, you're pushing prices too low. From the payer, certain academics, others, you're not doing enough, you're in the pockets of big pharma, and you're letting prices get out of control in this country. Over all this time, the Patent Act has never changed. It has never changed. But the attitude of the board has. And this is something that has disturbed me for some time. We've seen it, it's gradual, but it's been getting worse in the last couple of years. And that is the board is developing a bias. And I say the board as an organization, as an entity, is developing a bias that is anti-pharma. And as a result, it's running into more issues on compliance. And with the new guidelines and new regulations, when we all know that we don't know if they're going to stand up, they've already been challenged in court and successfully in part, but they're not going to get compliance with that. So the result is that they're going to be in court all the time. And every single case that comes forward, first thing that's going to happen is there'll be an allegation of bias because of the way the board has conducted itself. So I'm concerned that if things go ahead as planned, the whole system will collapse. And it may take a little while through the courts, but it will collapse. It cannot work in this situation today. I better stop there. Don't want to take up too much time. Sorry.
Thanks, Wayne, for the walk down history lane, and I'm sorry for what you're going through recently. It's that even the fact that you're here with us to do that is I think a testament of your commitment to seeing things, maybe the ship get righted. But I don't know, Neil, any thoughts on how things used to work, and what Wayne said in terms of how things have shifted, and what are your perspectives even on some of the stuff that I presented earlier?
Thanks, Bill, and thanks to Cord for inviting me back. So a few things. One, when the guidelines were being developed in the late 80s and into the early 90s, as Wayne was outlining, it was within a framework of the Pmprb being a quasi-judicial tribunal. And the idea was to come up with guidelines that were, the phrase bright guideline was used. Bright in the sense that patentees could know ahead of time, or manufacturers could know ahead of time exactly how price tests would be applied, and if their prices exceeded those guidelines, what the process would be going forward. And throughout this process throughout the development, as well as the interpretation and application of the guidelines, was the sense that this overriding sense that we're part of a quasi-judicial tribunal, part of a court. And as Wayne was mentioning, this whole notion of trying to avoid bias wherever possible. Everybody, of course, has their own opinions, but the whole idea was to avoid bias. And the guidelines, when they were developed, the price tests. So the price tests are outlined in the guidelines, and that's what manufacturers or patentees relied on, the application of those tests. And if they applied those tests, which, while somewhat complex, for the vast majority of manufacturers, they could apply those tests, see what the result is, and know if they charged that price, they would remain within the guidelines, and had some confidence that that would be the case. And if things proceeded, then beyond that to an investigation or a hearing, the Pmprb would continue to apply those same price tests in making their allegations at a hearing as to whether or not a price was excessive. And because they're bound by the factors in the Act, and the staff of the Pmprb were always considered to be bound by the guidelines. So what's changed? Well, setting aside the whole notion of bias for the moment, the notion that the guidelines would be binding on on the boards and the board staff, or on the board staff in particular, has now changed. And Pmprb now, and again, you can look at the guidelines that are coming into effect, as well as how they're applying these guidelines and investigations, is that those guidelines, the Pmprb staff are now making up new price tests that were never there before. And this has happened in the Alexion case. It happened in the Copaxone case, which goes back several years now, and as well as Horizon and other cases where it's evident that they're going to make up new price tests as they go. And if they've enshrined this whole part of their new policy. So manufacturers no longer have the certainty in terms of even if they respect the guidelines as written, that those guidelines may not even in fact be what the board staff and the board ultimately relies on in terms of application of or in terms of the course of that investigation. Now, the board panel is always free to interpret the Act and the excessive price factors there any way they like, but was always binding on the Pmprb staff to rely on the guidelines as written and to apply those tests. And so that's an important change because the certainty is gone. The second thing that's happened is it's the whole notion of avoiding excessive prices. And I think it was mentioned earlier about abuse of patent or abuse of their monopoly position by charging prices that, someone might say are egregious. And that's usually with respect to exceeding some maximum amount. And so the move away from, for example, the highest price in the therapeutic class to some middle price in some cases, a median price, suggests that it's no longer this notion of exceeding some maximum price or egregious pricing, but rather a policy of seeking lower prices generally. And in fact, as the analysis has shown, that the goal is to ensure prices on average are lower than the OECD median. So it's a complete departure from avoiding high prices to enforcing low prices and ensuring those prices are lower than what the OECD median prices would be, and the Pmprb 11 reference countries are a proxy for that OECD. So it's a significant change. And if I can just touch on finally, and I don't want to use up too much time, but if we go back to the hearing process, and Wayne brought it up, this whole notion of bias, and we've seen from some of the latest disclosures that there's this, the communication plan would suggest that there's already a bias towards the industry. But I'd like to talk a little bit about the patient perspective, where clearly patients are portrayed as being, for lack of a better word, the enemy. And patient groups have the right to seek leave to intervene at hearings. And that leave to intervene is something that is granted by a Pmprb hearing panel. And if that hearing panel and the Pmprb generally is already of the view that patient groups shouldn't be heard from because they're biased, that bias is already there, that the voice of patient groups at hearings will no longer be something that's available to patient groups to pursue. And I think that's really, really important, because it comes back to, again, the Pmprb is a quasi-judicial tribunal. It applies the act through hearings in cases where manufacturers and the Pmprb can't agree on what prices are. And there's a really important role for patient groups to seek to intervene in these cases, to present their case. And if the Pmprb has already decided that it doesn't respect the views of patient groups, that's a real problem. I'll leave it there for now.
Thanks so much, Neil. That was a great compliment to Wayne. Double-barreled question, actually, for both Marissa and Lorene, if you wouldn't mind. First, what do the changes mean to your organizations in terms of what you can do in Canada in terms of both research and bringing new medicines for rare disorders to Canadians? And second, are there alternatives? Are there alternatives already working their way through Canada through PCPA or other mechanisms? And and right now we're actually consulting on a rare disease strategy. Draw on some of your global experience, if you wouldn't mind, and is there a different or better way forward that would actually provide access and address some of the affordability challenges that this is ostensibly aimed at? Maybe we'll start with you, Marissa, if you won't mind.
Sure, thanks, Bill, and thanks to Dehan and Cord for letting me part of this panel. As Bill mentioned, I'm the general manager for Sanofi Genzyme, and we're part of a global pharma company. So my major responsibility, I would say my most important responsibility, is to advocate for Canada in all respects at senior levels. And that includes investments, that includes for resources, and especially for new product launches. And we've had some recent positive victories on the investment front on the vaccine side. But when it comes to rare diseases, the conversation at the moment is very different. We compete on the global stage for investment in terms of early launch of therapies, in terms of clinical trial investment, in addition to our manufacturing facilities. Yet Canada represents only 2% of the global pharma market. So that makes it a very difficult conversation at the table when the expectation is that Canada drug prices will be among, if not the lowest in the world. which could be the outcome under the new Pmprb guidelines. I think in the past, Canada has generally fared well in international terms. Certainly within our organization, Canada has been what we call a tier 1 country or a first wave launch country. We have a strong reputation for quality science, for clinical research, which really is a critical building block for future access. So these are positive aspects within Canada that other nations would love to have. But when it comes to rare disease, Canada is sending a very mixed or a muddled message or a negative message right now. To the extent that we can plan into the future, and Neil spoke to this, the major uncertainties raised by the Pmprb changes is what's really having an impact. That unpredictability for a manufacturer, for an organization in terms of commercialization therapies in Canada really is at the crux of the issue. So these are the wrong changes at the wrong time. It's making Canada far less competitive and attractive when compared to other countries for new investments and launches, which is clearly not a situation we want to be in. There are still way too many questions about what rules will be applied and when. So Bill, you asked, what does that represent? Bottom line, delays being pushed to tier 2, tier 3, which translates to years in terms of access for patients in Canada. Or worst case scenario is that's no access in the future to these innovative, these life-changing or life-saving therapies. Companies are having to make really difficult decisions at the moment as to whether to bring these therapies to Canada or not. But it's not just the commercialization piece. You presented the data on clinical trials, and I spent the first half of my career in clinical research. This will translate to a reduction in the number of clinical trials. We're already seeing that, and it will continue to get worse. And that is an important component of early access for patients. So what do I see that's missing here? Obviously a national and a holistic rare disease strategy. Canada is one of the very few developed countries that does not have that currently. And that's not just about treatment access. That's about improving screening, diagnosis, in addition to access to therapies and patient education. Clearly, we need a seat and a voice at the table, and not just from an industry perspective, but all key stakeholders, and that includes patients and patient advocacy groups and physicians and treaters that are responsible for these patients. But a seat and a voice that gives us meaningful and transparent dialogue and conversation, and that is not something that we have had in the past. I think we see in countries that have done well in the pandemic, and if we take that as an analogy, where industry has had good relationships with government, where they've had trusted and transparent partnership, we've seen them respond, much quicker and much better to the pandemic. So we need to be able to have that meaningful and transparent dialogue and conversation with the government that really does put patients at the center. I think we can leverage work that's done in other countries, and we can look to countries such as the UK and countries in Europe that provide access much earlier. I think there needs to be real consideration for accepting data that's relevant to rare disease populations, such as real world evidence, and having innovative and fruitful discussions around solutions such as risk sharing or managed access agreements. So I think there's a lot more that can be done, but we need a willingness to have an open and an honest dialogue to be able to get there. So maybe I'll stop and let Lorraine speak from her perspective.
Over to you, Lorraine. You sat on the steering committee, I think, for guidelines. So were those bright lines that we ended up with? But go ahead, wherever you want to go, Lorraine.
Well, I think, Marissa, Wayne, and Neil have said it very well, and I can maybe just underpin some of the conversation. So first of all, thank you to Cord and to Bill for the opportunity to speak. And yes, I have sat on the guideline committee with Pmprb and was involved in many of the changes back through its history. So sat on many of the different committees where there was a true consultation. I think when, even though Wayne has suffered PTSD, back in those days, there was genuine consultation. There was a willingness to hear a side of the table, and I deliberately say a side of the table because that's the perception, is that we're sitting on two separate sides of the table, when in reality we should be sitting at a round table where there's open, honest dialogue and a conversation, particularly in the rare disease space, but more broadly about what the true problem is we're trying to solve. When we look at PmprB's own data, it clearly shows that we've not been pricing outside of the guidelines. And, you know, one of the most urgent and time-sensitive things to solve is that perceptual bias. And I believe that Wayne spoke about it, but there is a real need to have, as Marissa said, an open conversation, a productive conversation, and one that is focused on solutions. The industry has spent time and energy and has been very engaged at wanting to provide solutions, but they've not been met with any bit of receptivity. And I think Marissa really underpinned it when she said, you know, it's very difficult. We are less than 2% of the international market, and we do have to ask for and really compete for not only resources, but approach to commercialization. And, you know, Canadian drug prices impact prices in other markets, which can have a substantial and significant impact on prices globally. And, you know, with so many different layers, so many different elements, the functional and administrative elements that are proposed in the new guidelines, it's overwhelming at best. And with all the uncertainty, it makes it very difficult for organizations to make a deliberate decision. They carefully weigh their decisions, whether or not to bring, first of all, commercial operations to Canada, trials and or new medications. And as a Canadian, that makes me very sad.
Thanks so much. We talked earlier about one thing that has sort of shifted since I'd say the mid 2000s, and that's product listing agreements and rebates. So, and we talked a little bit about this in the prep call. You know, those deals are actually happening, and now Pmprb is hoping to get involved to some extent, or at least have visibility on those deals, and regulate or have some influence over what the prices would be in that context. We talked about alternative solutions. Is there anything there that we can look at that might be a way forward? Maybe this is back to Neil and Wayne. I mean, isn't the PCPA doing a lot of deal making now that is actually driving value? Do you think that's just not being shown properly as valuable? What's the deal here, Wayne?
Well, you know, I think, Bill, there are many, many ways of approaching the whole issue of appropriate drug pricing and reimbursement. One of the reasons I became involved with CORD was because it seemed to me this is the real challenge in the future of healthcare, is how do we best allocate resources to these very effective but very expensive new technologies? How do we decide who gets what? I think the bottom line for my message is the Pmprb is not the way to do it. And to give the board staff credit, they are obviously conscientious, bright people. They want to play a role, but the Patent Act doesn't give them that opportunity. The action is taking place at PCPA, it's taking place at CADF, it's taking place in the rare disease strategy, and the kinds of programs that Durhan and CORD have been advocating for a number of years, managed entry agreements, coverage with evidence development, other type of funding arrangements to deal with these issues. But a simple price regulation of ceiling price isn't the way to address that. And I think that's where we've got into problems here. We're using the wrong mechanism to deal with a very important challenge.
Thanks, Wayne. We're actually running pretty short on time, so I'd invite Neil, Lorene, or Marissa to jump in with any final thoughts before we hand the conch over to the patient organizations for the second panel. Any final thoughts from this perspective before we hear from patients?
Sure. So I'll just, thanks, Bill. I'll just add that, you know, you mentioned in your talk that or maybe it was Wayne, that the Patent Act hasn't changed since, you know, December of 1987, There may have been some minor amendments, but no meaningful changes. But what has changed is the creation of PCPA and the role of CADIT and INES and everything else. So Pmprb in its current role is really not fit for purpose anymore because of the existence of PCPA. And Pmprb, frankly, needs to get out of the way of PCPA and INES and CADIT so they can do their jobs properly. Because right now, Pmprb is a barrier for products coming into Canada and going through that process. It's already there. I'll leave it at that. Of course, lots more to say, but we're out of time.
And yes, Neil, actually, Durhan wanted a quick question probably to you, because you've spoken on it before. What happened to the Pmprb's role of encouraging investment in R&D with the pricing policy? I don't know if Wayne, you're shaking your head there. Why don't you take that?
Well, I'll jump in. Sorry, Neil, but I'll jump
right.
in. Pmprb never had a role in encouraging R&D. And I think that's a misunderstanding. It was the Patent Act changes in 1987 that were intended in part to help encourage R&D by creating a more favorable IP environment, more in line with our trading partners, but not the Pmprb. It's not a factor that the Pmprb takes into account in assessing price at all. Its sole job was to report the R&D spending by manufacturers. And there's been no desire on the part of the Pmprb to recommend changes to those definitions that they use, nor from the government to recommend those changes. But I think there's a growing consensus that the definitions are completely out of date and do not reflect the current reality of the pharmaceutical investment market. And the recent Stats Canada report reinforces that by showing that, in fact, spending is probably more than double what Pmprb reports. So I think I always find it frustrating on this topic, and so I jumped in, I guess, because it's not a function or role of the Pmprb at all. It can't take credit or blame for anything that happens on R&D.
I'll just add to that very quickly. The reason there was an R&D put into the regulations and the Act at all was to make sure that the industry met their commitments that they made in 1987 and 88 and further commitments later on, that they actually made them, that they respected the commitments they made. That was it. Nothing further than that. It's just regulatory and legislative inertia that this whole sort of the provisions are still in the Act and the regulations without any update. For example, the definition of R&D is how it read on December 1st, 1987. That's how they define R&D. Completely out of date.
Well, we've covered 3.5 decades, so that's pretty good for one starter kickoff panel. Durhan, don't you think? And Lorene, Marissa, any final thoughts from you? Because we're going to move on to the patients, if not, and last words.
Yeah, I would just, reiterate some of the other words. There are other ways to address pricing and financial concerns without setting Canada back. We do not need this to be done by Pmprb. So I would encourage everybody to continue the great advocacy work that they're doing. I know I don't need to say that to Durhan because she will never give up, but everybody else that's on the call, this is just way too important. We need to be able to have a meaningful and an open and honest dialogue and to partner to make this a sustainable and a resilient healthcare system for rare disease patients in Canada. So.
And Lorene?
I would echo Marissa and say make your voices heard, because the more we do, hopefully we will be heard.
Thanks so much. Well, Durhan, over to you for panel 2. You've got some voices lined up. I can actually bring the screen up in terms of thank you so much, panel 1, Neil, Wayne, Marissa, Lorene. That was excellent, a great kickoff. So panel 2, let's hear from some voices that will be heard because of who they are and what they have to say. Thanks so much.
Okay, so thank you so much for that great panel. And I love the fact that it really was a lot of a dialogue and really an opportunity. And a huge thanks to Bill, as always, for masterfully taking us through some of the core issues. So we've got again, as I said, this was not our intent. It was to actually have this panel for here. We really want to talk about what can we do to foster, local, Canadian-made R&D to add to the supply of rare disease drugs. But I think some of the events over the past week and a half maybe it's only been a day, I can't remember now. It's been so fast and furious, have given us, really the challenge to say we have to talk about it from the patient perspective. And I did talk, talk about the fact that it feels like we've broken trust with the patients. And I say this as a preliminary, and I'll have, really invite the panel there to speak. You'll see we've got, Garo Tara, from the Gastrointestinal Society, along with, I'll skip down one, Martin Elias, who the three of us were like the three musketeers, and along with Lorraine, who was one of the few voices that kept speaking up at the steering committee meeting, really trying to kind of make, some real sense out of what we were feeling was absolute nonsense in these steering committees or these non-steering committees. Because we actually had no steering role at all in those meetings. So that was absolutely, I think, something that was important. Do I have the panelists here? If you guys are here, if you got your cameras on? Okay, I just haven't got my screen set up properly. I apologize. It's one way to see everybody. And then, with Kim and Chris, both from the Canadian Cystic Fibrosis community, really speaking to, certainly what the huge concerns were when they were coming into this, and really the very, very effective patient voice that they brought into this. And I'm really thrilled to have somebody who hasn't necessarily been at least a panelist in any of our discussions to date, and that is a really, really great advocate, Michelle Cabo Bianco, who I have known in other respects from the Pancreatic Cancer Canada. And I think the reason I really am happy to have her here, because I think it really is an important voice to bring to the table from another patient perspective. So I'm going to turn it over to the panel without a whole lot of further ado, except to say that, again, those of you who, just a bit of a preamble, those of you who, may not have been fully focused on the series of events that took place over the last day or so with the the access to information, release of the communiques, the internal communications of the Pmprb, that really highlighted, I think, as Bill showed, some of the outrageous comments that were being said inside. I don't know if it's a smoking gun, but I can tell you the first time I looked at it, I said, oh my gosh, no wonder we felt the way that we did, that we weren't being heard, that there was in fact a real bias, that we were in fact being denigrated. We knew that and we felt it. It was just that, okay, now we see it, that was absolutely what was happening. We weren't nuts. It wasn't just that we were imagining these, even though we didn't really feel we were, but it was absolutely horrifying to see this on a document. And then, of course, as a follow-up, Cord wrote a very strong letter back. Best Medicines Coalition, which was also named, wrote something back. Chris from the Canadian Cystic Fibrosis Treatment Society really put out a couple of his own. I mean, we responded, and unfortunately, the response that came back from the Pmprb and the chair of the board was not, yeah, we think we made a mistake, we've overstepped, we really apologize to the patients for, maligning them and for not really taking seriously, what can we do to really hear you? Our intent was not to, cut you out. Our intent was not to dismiss you. Instead, there was a doubling down to say, no, we did nothing wrong. It was you guys that were wrong all the time. All we got was these vociferous comments back and every time. So, I mean, it was a true shock to have that kind of response back. And then to say, well, if you want to talk to us at any time, just reach out. Like, hello, you're in charge here. You're the ones that are supposedly be the policymakers, the adults in the room. If we are saying that we are not being heard and we feel, maligned, it is your responsibility to at least hear that. And instead we got, not only a deafening wall, but we actually got a big pushback to say, once again, you guys are out of line. So I think this is really serious, because this puts into really, I think, as panel one has said for us, really serious contention as to what the intentions of the current, grouping at the Pmprb is about. So I'll stop from there and really kind of invite the panelists to start. We sort of had an order, but I think we might move it around just a little bit. But I really want to open up with Kim Steele from Cystic Fibrosis Canada. Again, one of the outstanding patient groups in this space. And I don't think anybody, can kind of suspect that Cystic Fibrosis Canada is doing anything but acting in the best interest of their patients. And if there is any group that is not, kind of speaking in any way except in their own interests, I think is CF. So I'm going to hand it over to you, Kim.
Thanks, Johan, and thanks, Bill. Thanks all of you for having us here today. Myself in particular, I'm Kim Steele. I'm the Director of Government and Community Relations for Cystic Fibrosis Canada. Relevations of the contents of the Pmprb communications plan and the related Pmprb and Health Canada staff correspondence comes at a time when our community is sick and tired of having to fight for access to every life-changing, disease-altering medicine that has ever been made for cystic fibrosis. We have had to fight every step of the way, and this is a community that is sick and tired to begin with. While we currently have a game-changing therapy that can treat up to 90% of the Canadian CF population under review with Health Canada, we also have one genetically tailored therapy that treats the basic defect of the disease for some people with the disease that has been available in Canada since 2013, another since 2016, but only a few Canadians with CF can access these drugs because of government delays and red tape. If we had a rare disease strategy in place like so many other countries have had for years, some for decades, we would not be here today, but here we are. Right now, only the sickest among us have a chance of getting these medicines. A chance. That is it. Only those who are on transplant lists and who are nearing death or dying can access these medicines, and some can't even do that. And I'd like to take a moment to remember all of those we have lost along the way, those who just couldn't fight any longer, and those who couldn't wait any longer.
Thank you.
Thank you for that.
No, thank you so very much, Kim. And, my one word to all the panels was kind of, I know we're going to all have a lot of emotion coming in here. And it is important that you can use that emotion, but it's really also, as you say, the amazing facts behind it. And how did we ever get to this point? I think that's the question.
And
right?
this is where I'm going, Johan. So it's within this context that I say that we were devastated when we found out that the regulator that is supposed to protect us from excessive drug prices has maligned us as a patient community and sees us as opponents rather than allies in the fight for access. This, despite the fact that we showed up for consultations, directed our own internal expert resources to thoughtful, data-driven, creative solutions of how to lower drug prices in ways that will not run access to innovative medicines for rare diseases into the ground. While our current medicines have cleared the Pmprb, we also know that their prices could be investigated at any time under the new guidelines, and we worry about future access to promising therapies in the pipeline. CF Canada's mission is to end CF, and we can't do that if Canadians with CF can't access these drugs along the way to a cure and ultimately to the cure itself. The Pmprb communications plan and the surrounding correspondence showed us that even though many of us support lower drug prices, as evidenced in our written submissions, our voices were not heard. And quite frankly, it seems like they did not want to hear our voices at all, as illustrated in their own written words. This is not in keeping with the values of meaningful consultation, and it calls into question the entire consultation process that the Pmprb undertook with patients and patient groups. Does our expertise and do our lived experiences not matter to the very people for whom access could mean life or death? Last week, Kelly Grover, our president and CEO, made a powerful presentation to HESA on the impact this communications plan is having on our community and our faith in the Pmprb, in its ability to meet its mandate and to work in meaningful ways with patients and patient groups. If you haven't seen it, I recommend you do. And I understand that Chris McLeod will be speaking. He has crafted the asks that have become the rallying cry of our community, and we are all getting behind them, and we will see this through.
Thank you very much, Kim. So we do have all those links that are posted. We do have some of those are also the documents on our site and on, I know, on your site as well. Michelle, I'm going to ask you to wade in here. Maybe just introduce yourself and kind of why, certainly the Pmprb itself, but also why this whole, a malignment of the patient groups, and I can't use any other word. There's no nicer word for it. Has become such a concern, certainly to you and to your community, and it really compelled you to speak up and say, look, we have to kind of come into this. We have not necessarily taken an active role because we don't necessarily have an active drug at the moment, but we cannot just sit by any longer.
Thanks, Derhan. I'm Michelle Bianco. I'm the CEO of Pancreatic Cancer Canada. I could certainly share with you the statistics around pancreatic cancer, that there's a 92% mortality rate and how many of our people have died, but you're well aware of that. And I think, Derhan, to your point about why we haven't become more involved to date, the issue for me is that while I don't want to in any way denigrate this gathering or the time that everybody spent, because it is so valuable, but this is not moving the needle forward. Speaking back and forth to each other about how upset we are and how frustrated and how each one of our patients is suffering is not changing anything. And so I was hoping that what we could discuss today was some kind of radical, if you will, move forward, that we do something different, because writing letters and, with all respect to the lobbyists, lobbying is not changing this. This is not changing. And so in my mind, if you always do what you always done, you're going to not end up where you want to be. And so I would really invite people to sort of bring ideas about what we could do differently that would really gather attention.
Thank you very much. And I think, hopefully by the end of this, we will come back to it. I do think it's been powerful, though. And if you look at one of the exciting things about the communique for me was the fact that they really feel like they're on the back foot now. That in fact, the communications from the patients advocates and certainly from, many others have really taken a hold. And this is why this communique and the hiring of, somebody else to help do the communications, et cetera, outrageous as it is, does also indicate that, this is a way forward. But we would be, I think there are a lot of people here that would be very much into, much more, even more radical kind of movements, because I feel like we're all being pushed at that point. So thank you very much. I'm going to switch over then to two of my, I don't know, what do we call them, whatever we were at the steering committee meeting, and maybe talk a little bit, not necessarily about your experience there, but really a bit of also maybe some reflection, but also looking forward, where do we go from here? What do we take from what we learned at that steering committee? Where are we now in terms of what we currently know, and where do we go from here? Because the advocacy is very strong and the commitment, I think the patient community is strong, but how else then can we move this, given what I really feel is some real real weakening in terms of certainly the Pmprb and their face in terms of the public. But Gail, maybe I'll start with you.
Sure. Thank you so much. We were on that steering committee, and I posted a link up in the chat. We were on that steering committee from about mid-2018 on to mid-2019. And when you say, you're on a steering committee, I just want to put that a bit in context, is that we would get bundles of information that would take hours to read before we actually showed up at those meetings. And we're patient groups, and we didn't get funded to do this. We did this volunteer. We also did this from our own charity budgets. And so we did that in good faith and in the best intention. We went there because we thought we were invited to consult. Now, I was there not only on behalf of the Gastrointestinal Society, but on behalf of the Best Medicines Coalition, of which I was chair at the time. And the Best Medicines Coalition put volumes and volumes of work in from its multiple members. And its CEO, Executive Director Paulette Eddy put tons of work into this as well. So I just want to share that it was a collective energy of so much work looking at all this. And just to put it in that in perspective, then partway in, so that was about mid-2018, partway in was when the big fiasco happened, when Doug Clark, the frustrated bureaucrat, was interviewed by Kelly Crow. And at that point in time, and
sorry, Gail, you suddenly went on mute.
Sorry, there we go. And I just added it to the chat, where this is the media story that came out where he was interviewed. And in that he said, really out of the blue, that there was not a lot of daylight between industry and farm and patient groups. And again, that was just like a slap across the face from all the work that we were doing in good faith, and to have Doug go out and do this. And now, and then, of course, he was no longer involved in the meetings, and Tanya Potashnik. And welcome to the meeting, Tanya. I see you're on the list of attendees, and good for you to be here. Thank you. But I want to just say that in that process, I felt that when we made contributions at that time that you would just say, thank you for your input. And I would challenge you to show us how any of our input, any of our feedback was received constructively, because we spent a lot of time trying to give you constructive feedback. So I'm just putting that out there that at some point, we have to do this. Now, I want to put again in context of what all this is that our group started almost 45 years ago because a 22-year-old woman died from Crohn's disease. People don't die from Crohn's disease anymore because they have awesome biologic medications that are essential to life-saving and contributing. These individuals go on and contribute to life. My own mother has Crohn's disease. It's a very, very important thing for me personally. But all of us out there have friends and family who have chronic diseases or acute diseases that require access to these medications. And the other big thing that concerns me about what Pmprb is doing is, once they're stopping all these medicines from coming to Canada for the new ones, they're going to have a chat and go look back at existing medications and sort of reprice those and reassemble those. So that could very well mean that drugs that we already have access to are also in jeopardy. So, I'm hoping we can have a bit more discussion toward the end of our panel. So I'll stop there so that others can get a chance to really sort of talk about the fundamental things that are bothering them about this whole process, as well as the potential outcomes.
Thank you very much, Gail. And as I said, we don't want this just to be a look back and a rag on what happened. But I think unless we actually come to grips with what did happen, we're not going to be able to move forward. So I appreciate Michelle's, frustration in terms of our not being able to take bigger action. But, those of us in some respects were suckered along in this process as well. We thought we were at a consultation. We had little notion that, there was not really one. Martine, if you don't mind, introduce yourself, and maybe, you can build on what Gail is, but also come in, I think, with your own, kind of where you guys are now.
Sure. Thank you very much, Darhan, for having me today. And thank you everyone else for being here. This is a very, very important topic to discuss because it really touches what's most important for patients, and it's access to life-giving therapies. And, the only thing that patients want is to have access to those medication, and anything to do with regulation and pricing, that there's bodies to be able to, work on this and come up with solution. And just so if people don't know me, I'm the executive director of Myeloma Canada. We're a small patient organization, but we're pretty mighty. So I'm told by my daughter, who had a conversation with someone who works at Pmprb, who she met at a social function, and shared with her how strong our organization was, even for our size, and that we really made some noise. So, you know what, I'm really proud of this, that as a small organization, we're able to have a voice heard. But those are not the kinds of conversation I want to hear back. I want to hear back that, we're a pain in their side because of what we do. I want to hear things that we're partners. We understand where patients are coming from. We want to listen to you. And if I reflect back at the time I spent on the steering committee, I found it, very much of an eye-opening experience, because what I was witnessing, and I'm sure Gail and Darhan would agree with me, is that there's one side who wants to work and is looking for solutions and understand that they have to make compromise. And then there's the other side, the government side, who are very much entrenched in what they want to do. It's like there's no way or the highway, my way or the highway, and there's no willingness to discuss and look at where do we want to end up. Because I think if we sat down and we asked ourselves, where do we want to be? Where do we want Canada to be from an ecosystem for drug research, for access to medication, and decide what that's going to look like, and then work back from there, we can find the route to get there. And there's different options. I think, we discussed some of the access to clinical trials, which are really important, and we're seeing less and less coming to Canada. So that's also another big issue. If you look at, 87, when Pmprb was created, I was like just brand new baby in the industry. And I remember going to Ottawa to fight for the access and some of the regulations that were put in place by Pmprb. And, you look at clinical trials and research, well, there was a yardstick that was established, but the environment changed. I mean, we changed from the imperial system to the metric system because we needed to. Well, why can't we change the way we measure how clinical dollars are invested in Canada? We evolve, we change, and I really see, an entrenchment on the part of the Pmprb for not wanting to change, not looking at what the right route it is to get to where we want to go. So that's very frustrating. So, what I see is lack of trust on, for patient organizations, the malignedness, it really makes me mad because, I've always been of the view that you have to leave your bias, your prejudice at the side and come with good faith. And I don't see that happening right now. So we really have to go back to square one, is my opinion.
Okay, so we're going to come back to square one at some point and bring everybody back in. But before we go there, I'm going to turn it over to Chris because I think Kim, as Kim says, Chris has done some of the real work in terms of putting out the positions and the call to action. I quite frankly, the first time I saw Chris and saw what he was doing, I said, is he nuts or what? Like how on earth do you have this guy who's a patient, who's now coming out and trying to raise, kind of legal action, at that time against trying to get access. And then as this moved on, always, coming back to there's something totally illegitimate about all of this. And I have to say, hats off to you, Chris, for really raising some of those hard, questions and really at least positioning some other ways that we need to address it. So, some of you will know is that, there are a number of lawsuits that are taking place, as you saw there. One that, in federal court, which partially, sort of, approved and allowed the PMB to go on with what it was doing, but also came back and said, but you cannot kind of overstep your role in terms of asking for, what the actual prices are, which was a big challenge in terms of, okay, how are you going to be able to monitor this? And then also then in the Quebec court to also kind of try to stop the action. And then more recently, as I said, the Quebec lawsuit. So I'm going to turn it over to Chris. And Chris promised that he would, number one, speak not in lawyerese so that we can understand what he's talking about. And two, he's not going to get overwhelmed by his emotions so that we can understand what he's talking about. So with those huge restrictions in place, Chris, I turn it over to you. Introduce yourself. And really, we really do appreciate and want to hear what you're saying here.
Thank you. Thank you, Dirhan. Thank you, Cord, for hosting this. It's been invaluable. I appreciated the earlier remarks by Neil and Wayne. It was informative. I'm learning a lot, as I always do whenever I'm able to get on these webinars and seminars. The Cystic Fibrosis Treatment Society was set up with a single mandate to secure access for individuals that needed life-saving CF meds. Full disclosure, I have CF. I am on one of the gene modulators. I'm not eligible for Trikafta, but would be eligible potentially for what might come down the pipeline. So I'm particularly concerned and interested in access to future medications as a result. The two issues that are really front and center in my view at the moment are obviously access to life-saving medications, and what's now moved to the forefront is the rule of law. The rule of law, and just to give sort of the quick two-sentence definition, it's the principle of governance where all people, institutions, whether the Pmprb or any of the other hundreds of institutions, public and private, individuals, corporations, were accountable to laws that are put forward by government, equally enforced, and independently adjudicated. And this echoes back to what Neil and Wayne were speaking of. This is a quasi-judicial body. It is subject to the rule of law. It must be independent, objective, and it must not be biased. So in light of the memorandum that we're all aware of that came out from the Pmprb, this is a memorandum from a quasi-judicial independent body that is meant to actually adjudicate over laws subject under the Patent Act and its regulations and guidelines. And then the letter that came from the chairman of the board of the Pmprb, where I think everyone's aware of the letter. I don't need to go into details on either the memo or the correspondence that circulated. So what we have asked for is a full investigation. We've asked that the Office of the Auditor General do this investigation into the recent actions of bias and impartiality of a quasi-judicial body that's meant to be part of the fabric and govern the rule of law. So investigations have been requested of the Office of the Auditor General, the Secretariat of the Treasury Board, which has specific jurisdiction to look into actions within the public service sector. And we've also asked that the Integrity Commissioner of the Public Service, a gentleman by the name of Mr. Joe Friday, launch another investigation. So we have 3 separate investigations we've requested. Office of the Auditor General, the Treasury Board, and the Integrity Commissioner. Those investigations need to be fulsome and they need to be complete. They need to report to the Cabinet and the Prime Minister. So that's one tranche of efforts that need to be put underway, specifically around the rule of law. Okay, so this is way far beyond just access to medications. This goes to the fundamental core of a democratic society, the erosion of institutions. Specifically, our concern as patients is this was an institution that in large measure was put in place to protect the most vulnerable from excessive pricing as part of securing access. The second bundle of where this is being adjudicated is obviously we have 3 court cases that are now seeking at the appellate level. The one that the CF Treatment Society is a party to, intervened and became a party in Quebec to constitutionally challenge the, I'll try not to get into legalese with this. We are challenging the Pmprb regs and guidelines that have been implemented as being unconstitutional. Unconstitutional jurisdictionally. In Canada, the federal government has jurisdiction over certain powers. The provinces have a jurisdiction over other powers. We are saying that the amendments to the Patent Act infringe or have the federal government trenching upon areas of power that are within the purview of the provinces. And that is why this is unconstitutional. So it's a division of powers argument as opposed to a charter of rights and freedoms argument, okay? Until we have decisions by the court, and right now it's at the Court of Appeal in Quebec, the Quebec government has just intervened in the Quebec constitutional case, again, challenging the constitutionality of these regs. So until we have judicial determinations from the highest courts of the land on whether these regs are even constitutional, and until we have fulsome investigations completed by the investigative bodies that we've made requests to, and those reports are back, there can be no implementation of these guidelines or regulations. At this, forget what we may want as individuals or patient groups. This goes to the core of a democratic process. This goes to the rule of law. This is far bigger and broader than simply some patients who wish access or have concerns with an institution that governs them. In that broader context, these regs need to be immediately stayed. So Michelle, on Cabo Bianco, when you were raising the point, and I agree with you, we can't just be sort of an echo chamber, but currently we have real and meaningful asks that are far broader than a challenge between stakeholders within the umbrella of the PmprB's auspices to secure or to hold off on excessive prices for patients or for drugs entering into the country. This goes to the core of the institutional framework in our democratic society. And we've got a clear ask. It's just been made in the past 10 days of investigations. Until this can be dealt with, there needs to be a stay of the implementation. And frankly, I used to think that before the memo and the letter from the chairman of the board, that stay could afford us the opportunity to re-engage in some meaningful consultations. I now think that what we really need to do, whether that proceeds afoot, I'll let others decide, I have real questions that the Pmprb is even constitutional, and that real thought needs to be put into the future of the Pmprb as an institution itself going forward, and what we do with it as a society in light of the real concerns it's raised to the rule of law in a democratic society.
Okay,
So
I'm going to stop you there, Chris.
Okay, I'm
but-
done.
Yeah, I know. Thank you very much. I just want to make sure we have enough time for Rosalie to also reflect back on it. But really, as I think everybody's saying, I wish we did have more time for discussion. I always jam it in with, I think, far too much amazing perspectives here. But it is the case, as you say, the advocacy action has to continue. And I think it is making a real impact, and it is being heard. And certainly, I think we cannot, on behalf of our patients, stop that. So that's really important. The second thing, I think, as Chris is saying, is that let's get behind, and Kim and I agree that look at what he's proposing. Let us really support that, because that speaks to the fundamentals. And I was so thrilled to hear both Wayne and Neil kind of raise that as, a real departure from what the Pmprb was supposed to do initially. And then third, I do want to raise again, next week we've got another consultation on the National Rare Disease Drug Strategy, which we also kind of always look at a little bit in amazement, because on the one hand, the federal government is saying, yes, we want to put together this huge billion-dollar initiative to make sure that patients can get access to innovative rare disease medicines. And on the other hand, we're going to allow, the Pmprb to put forth these really, really restrictive pricing, regulations and guidelines that are putting such a chill in terms of both the clinical trials and the new medicines coming in. And I always say somewhat facetiously, we'll have a great, rare drug access program with no drugs coming in. So this is something that has got to concern all of us, who are looking at where are the new medicines, So I think this is such an important issue. I'm going to stop there because I really also just want to acknowledge again what Chris has said, but also the opinion that we got from Professor Savoy. I really appreciate his taking the time to putting together this opinion for us, which really puts in even more legalese, but also with some of the other philosophical underpinnings, what Chris has been saying, and that as a quasi-judicial body, the Pmprb has really demonstrated that it is not an unbiased, it is not an impartial arbiter. And if it cannot be that, how can anybody have any faith in terms of what it's going to do? And certainly we cannot, as a country, we cannot as patients live in a system in which companies are going to hesitate to bring in their medicines, not only because, I think as Marissa says, the pricing may be so restrictive, but it creates this uncertainty in terms of what might happen. And I think, as Gail said as well, it really raises concerns about what might happen in terms of the drugs that are currently there. So this is not an environment that is going to be satisfactory. But I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to turn it over to Rosalie, because I really am so grateful that she's taken the time to spend with us on this entire panel, has participated with us in the past and on many other panels that I've heard her on, and invite her to introduce herself and also provide us with a bit of reflection on what you heard here and where do we go next.
Absolutely. And it really is an honor to, follow both those panels. And for those that might not have met me or don't know me yet or aren't familiar with the Institute, I am from the C.D. Howe Institute, which is a registered charity and an economic think tank with the mission of improving the welfare of Canadians through economically sustainable policy. And in the interest of being fully transparent, the health program that I oversee does receive funding from pretty much every stakeholder group we've discussed today. We receive funding support from physician groups, patient groups, government, pharma companies, generic and patenting, as well as the payers. So I really, it's really been, I guess, good to get into the details and really hear the lived experiences, because we, from where I sit, I tend to look at these issues somewhat as a bean counter and a bit from 30,000 feet. And so it really is those voices that add to any arguments I might make about what is appropriate or beneficial for Canadians, at the end of the day, that's people, that's you. And those stories are the reason for that we need to address the issues with the Pmprb. And so I guess that just as an initial thought, I just wanted to share a few, I guess I don't actually have the permission to share, and I can send my slides after, but I just wanted to share a few observations about the macro level and I guess the recent past and what I see happening in the public. And so the first thing is that prescription drug spending has been growing, but more slowly than other areas of healthcare spending, and actually accounts for a decreasing proportion of total health spending. As a percent of GDP, it decreased by 0.15 percentage points across over about a 10-year period. This data does end at about 2018, so it won't include the recent drops in GDP. Those numbers may not look so good now, but that's less to do with the spending and more to do with the GDP, but we have been spending a lot to get vaccines. The next observation, I wanted to go back to something Marissa mentioned about how Canada is only 2% of the global market. And while that sounds like we may not be that significant, I wanted to point out that the US market is fully 70%, which means everybody else accounts for only that 30%. So 2% of 30, I think, does make us still a significant market. And with the benefits of our diverse population, high levels of R&D, we are still very much an attractive place to do clinical trials, as long as our policy doesn't work at cross purposes. We really do have potential to increase our share of the global life sciences industry, even if that is the number remains being somewhere around 2% of profits, or slightly lower, slightly higher. The main point is that because the US is our next door neighbor, it is 70% of the global market, and prices there are 3 times higher than anywhere else in the world, that I think that the perception in the public about drug prices in Canada might be somewhat affected by the US, because it actually is a challenging issue there, and there is a valid argument that Canada is free riding off of the R&D and profits that fund that R&D in the US market. But compared to almost every other country, and at least the Pmprb 7, Canada isn't paying excessive prices based on the evidence that we have, and we don't know about those confidential discounts. And so that really brings me to the question of what are we really trying to do with these changes to regulations, if it's not simply to lower prices, because I do not see the evidence that our prices are excessive, since they are generally comparable to our peer countries. And with that, just wanted to reflect on the panel a little bit and echo some of the thoughts I think that we've already heard today, but that the Canadian Drug Agency, we have yet to really see what its role is going to be, and it has the potential to address some of the issues that have been sort of in the PmprB's wheelhouse, along with the Pan-Canadian Pharmaceutical Alliance, CADIF, and all these other institutions. As the Canadian Drug Agency gets set up, even without the judicial questions, I think that there is it is reasonable to question its role. What will it be? What should it be? And is it actually necessary with the future Canadian Drug Agency? And can we look at the design of that to really just make the Pmprb unnecessary? And my reasoning for that is simply that it is unique, and our peer countries do not seem to have a comparable quasi-judicial body and really implement policy through a combination of negotiations and separate track strategies that are flexible enough to ensure access, but are restrictive enough to ensure that prices aren't, bankrupting the government or crowding out other spending. And really, if there's one thing that I've drawn from the panelists, it's that the current impasse between government, pharma companies, and payers benefits no one, especially the patients, and that the potential for a rare disease strategy, and as well the recent experience with COVID, could lead us to a more beneficial path. And what I mean by that is that recent survey data has shown that Canadians prioritized access to medications as a higher priority than addressing seniors' care. And I think it's probably not a secret to everyone on this call exactly how tragic our results in seniors' care were related to COVID, but Canadians still put access above addressing that issue. And so what I would say to everyone on this call is that the issue that was somewhat a small patient groups or a minority of the population issue, because of COVID and the vaccination rollout and the experience with that, the public is more aligned with access and lowering prices than they would have been before. As well, they're more aware of the challenges we actually have with accessing new medications. And so I think that there is the potential for the combination of the controversy with the recent Pmprb, so I'll just say drama, and then the raised awareness in the public, as well as their stake in this issue, has never been higher. So I think this is the time for a broad conversation and trying to move the needle as much as possible while the public is fully aligned with access to new medications, and that it feels existential, not only to patients with rare diseases, but to everyone, because everyone felt the threat of not being able to access medication and what that could mean for them. And so the experience and the frustrations that every rare disease patient has had are, in a very small way, now familiar to almost everyone in Canada. And though that's not an economic argument, it is something that the government has a responsibility to deliver on policy that Canadians want, and Canadians want access. When you combine that, you can, sorry, I'm running out of time.
You're right at time, exactly. And I want to end on a really high note, because you've really taken us there. Not what I expected an economist to say, so this is great. Really, really appreciate your bringing it home for us and really putting it into such a positive frame. So this is something that we knew you were the right person, Rosalie, to kind of bring us here. Everything's about the timing, right? And as Rosalie says, maybe the timing has come. And a number of things have happened, both in terms of the discrediting of the Pmprb, but also, as you say, the wave of the public's support for access that we need to take advantage of, as well as the recognition of some options. And I think that rare disease strategy is for us that opportunity to say, we can do this, and we can come up with cost-effective, safe, but also affordable strategies under this new regime that will be Canadian Drug Agency, but just for rare diseases. So thank you very much for that. Bill, you want to just walk through very quickly. These are some of the resources and references we're saying. We do need to continue with the advocacy actions. We know they're making an impact. We're also quite pleased, but some of the media now have stepped up to really acknowledge that there are legitimate voices. There used to be many of us, in the patient community, if a reporter was calling you up, you would actually not want to answer, which is a horrible thing to say, because you knew that they were not going to actually, necessarily take what you say and put it out there in its true word, but really try to twist it around. That's a horrible thought. But we're really pleased to see some of this coming forth, and we're pleased to see other stakeholders step forward to really support what is happening here, including, say some of the messages here. And then this fight for our lives is still on. We really do encourage you to go in. We do think it's important that we get the message there. HESA's Bill has indicated is meeting again. We need to hopefully have that bit of an enlightenment that Rosalie's talking about, and the recognition of the challenges, you know, maybe bringing it forth in a different light, because the policymakers are only as good as the people that are really trying to get the message to them. So we really still need to trust that. Anything else there, Bill, maybe that we need to close off on?
No, nothing further. I think that's, you know, there are a bunch of resources here on this page, but this is just scratching the surface. Gail Atera with the GI Society has an impact report that came out in mid-December. In fact, maybe I know Angela's listening in and helping run this in the back end. We can probably, with our thank you note to all participants, send links to many more opportunities to get engaged and get involved. And you know, something that we had on the pre-call getting ready for one of the panels was, you know, where are the real facts here? There's people are speaking a different language. So let's all get on, you know, the same page with the same facts, and then bring that forward. That's another thing that I might just add, because that's something that I think has been missing in this discussion. So yeah, Angela, heads up, we'll get you that. Pull down the memo from Professor Savoie. It's on the chat group right at the top if you haven't already done so.
So I'm going to call for, and we have reached out back to the Pmprb. You know, they planned last March to have a roundtable between some of the stakeholders and with their board of directors. It never happened because of COVID. We tried to make it happen virtually, and at that time, I guess people were still hesitant in terms of what to do with it. We would like to call for that roundtable again. Let's have an open table, but let's make it public. It cannot be a closed event. We need to bring stakeholders to the table. We need to talk about a path forward. And yes, all of these other actions are really important, but we also know that unless we all get to the table and we have those open discussions, you know, in a truly, truly collaborative fashion, I mean, at the end of the day, there's going to be a solution and everybody's going to have to buy into it. So we need to contribute to it. So I invite everybody to keep their eye open. We're going to try to make that happen. And not be, you know, I think as Michelle quite rightly said, we cannot have one-sided discussions. We don't want them to be one-sided, and we appreciate very much. I see Pamela was on here, Tanya was on here. We've seen other people from the payers on here. We appreciate that in terms of all the others that have come on to these into these webinars. So thanks to everybody that was on here. We really, really appreciate, you know, whether you agree with us or not, whether you think we're, you know, either crazy or totally bought in or not, the fact that we're all here and we're all talking together, I think is really critically important. And we certainly do want to thank all the patients that have continued to work as hard as they have in terms of getting this message out there. So cheers to all. Next week, we have a really important webinar. This will be on the infrastructure necessary for a rare disease drug strategy. And we're going to talk about both some of the HTA processes and the real world evidence processes that are necessary, the core of bringing in these medicines that have high uncertainties. And we're also going to have, again, a huge panel that's going to talk to us about what do we have existing in Canada as part of that infrastructure that we can build on really to get a running start on a rare disease drug strategy. We do not have to wait for 2022. We don't even have to wait for $1 billion to drop in our laps. We can start doing this. And, you know, I mean, not that we don't want the $1 billion, but, you know, we're not holding our breaths to wait for that to happen before we can get going. So thanks to everybody again. Huge thanks to the panels, and especially thanks to Rosalie for those great comments at the end. And thanks again to Bill, as always, and Angela. Okay, thanks a lot, you guys.